Blood sugar regulation is one of the most precisely managed processes in the human body. Under normal circumstances, glucose levels in the bloodstream are kept within a relatively narrow range through a continuous interplay of hormones, organs, and metabolic pathways. When this regulation works well, energy is delivered to cells consistently, appetite is managed efficiently, and organs function without the strain that comes from prolonged glucose highs or lows. When it is disrupted, whether through disease, dietary pattern, lifestyle factors, or simply the physiological changes that accompany aging, the consequences extend well beyond energy fluctuations. Persistent dysregulation of blood sugar is associated with type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, kidney damage, and a range of other chronic conditions. This is why the management of blood glucose has become one of the most active and clinically important areas of modern medicine, and why dietary strategies for supporting stable blood sugar have attracted substantial interest from both researchers and clinicians. Within that conversation, the role of fruit in blood sugar management occupies a nuanced and frequently misunderstood position. Fruit contains sugar, primarily fructose, glucose, and sucrose, in varying proportions depending on the type. And this fact has led many people with blood sugar concerns to avoid fruit entirely, treating it as interchangeable with refined sugar or sweetened beverages. This is a significant oversimplification. Fruit also contains dietary fiber, water, polyphenols, vitamins, minerals, and a range of bioactive compounds that collectively alter the way its sugars are processed by the body. The distinction between consuming isolated sugars and consuming sugars embedded within the complex matrix of whole fruit is biologically meaningful and well documented in clinical research. Understanding this distinction is foundational to understanding why certain fruits, consumed in the right context, can actually support rather than undermine blood sugar stability. The fruit that has received the most consistent and well-documented attention in endocrinology and metabolic research for its blood sugar effects is berberine-containing fruit, and, more specifically, the common apple, though the research landscape also points strongly toward berries, particularly blueberries, as well as citrus fruits including grapefruit and certain varieties of orange. However, it is the apple, with its unique combination of soluble fiber in the form of pectin, polyphenols including quercetin and chlorogenic acid, and a moderate but manageable glycemic profile, that most frequently appears in research examining the afternoon dietary window and postprandial glucose stabilization. The practical identification of a single fruit as universally optimal across all individuals is not something the research supports without qualification, but apples have a body of evidence behind them that is broader and more consistent than most other candidates, and they are the most commonly referenced in clinical nutritional guidance for blood sugar management. To understand how an apple consumed at a specific time of day can influence blood sugar stability for an extended period, it is necessary to first understand what happens to blood sugar in the hours following a typical midday meal and why the mid-afternoon period is physiologically significant. After lunch, blood glucose rises in response to carbohydrate digestion, peaks somewhere between 30 and 90 minutes after eating, depending on the individual and the composition of the meal, and then declines as insulin facilitates glucose uptake into cells. In many people, including those without diagnosed diabetes, this post-lunch glucose curve is followed by an afternoon dip that occurs roughly between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. This dip coincides with a point in the circadian cycle when insulin sensitivity is beginning its natural afternoon shift, and when cortisol levels, which had been elevated earlier in the day, are declining. The result is a period in which energy availability can feel lower, concentration may be reduced, and appetite signals may emerge, the familiar afternoon slump that many people experience and often address with caffeine or a sugary snack. If that afternoon energy dip is addressed with a high glycemic food, a piece of candy, a sugary drink, a refined carbohydrate snack, blood glucose rises sharply and then falls again, creating a secondary oscillation that extends dysregulation further into the afternoon and evening. If it is addressed with a food that provides glucose slowly and in a buffered form, the glucose response is blunted, energy is delivered more consistently, and the subsequent evening meal is approached with more stable blood sugar and more measured appetite. This is the mechanistic context in which the 3 o'clock apple recommendation makes the most physiological sense. The primary mechanism by which apples buffer blood sugar is their soluble fiber content, specifically pectin. Pectin is a type of soluble dietary fiber found predominantly in the skin and flesh of apples. When consumed, pectin forms a viscous gel in the digestive tract that slows the rate at which the stomach empties its contents into the small intestine. This slowing of gastric emptying delays the absorption of sugars into the bloodstream, flattening the glucose curve that would otherwise result from carbohydrate consumption. The effect is not simply one of dilution. Pectin actively alters the physical environment of digestion in a way that reduces the rate of enzymatic carbohydrate breakdown and limits how quickly glucose can cross the intestinal wall into the bloodstream. This mechanism is well established in nutritional biochemistry and is one of the primary reasons that whole fruit produces a substantially different blood sugar response than equivalent amounts of fruit juice, which lacks the fiber matrix. A medium apple contains approximately 4 grams of dietary fiber, of which a significant portion is pectin. This may not seem like a large quantity in absolute terms, but the gel-forming properties of pectin are potent relative to its mass, and when pectin interacts with the water already present in the apple and the digestive fluids of the stomach, it creates a physical buffering effect that extends across the entire digestive process for that meal or snack. Studies that have examined the glycemic index of whole apples consistently find it to be substantially lower than would be predicted from the fruit's total carbohydrate content alone, precisely because the fiber matrix slows carbohydrate absorption in a way that the glycemic index of isolated sugar does not capture. Beyond pectin, apples contain a range of polyphenolic compounds that independently influence blood sugar through distinct biochemical pathways. Quercetin, one of the most well-studied flavonoids in apples, has been shown in research to inhibit certain enzymes involved in carbohydrate digestion, specifically alpha-glucosidase and alpha-amylase, which break down complex carbohydrates into absorbable sugars in the small intestine. By partially inhibiting these enzymes, quercetin reduces the rate at which dietary carbohydrates are converted to glucose, producing an effect that is mechanistically similar to the action of certain pharmaceutical agents used in diabetes management, including acarbose, which works by the same enzyme inhibition pathway. The concentration of quercetin in apples is not equivalent to a pharmaceutical dose, and the clinical effect should not be overstated. But the directional effect is consistent and has been documented in multiple controlled studies examining postprandial glucose levels in human subjects following apple consumption. Chlorogenic acid, another polyphenol present in significant concentrations in apples, has been studied for its effects on glucose transport and insulin signaling. Research suggests that chlorogenic acid may reduce the rate of glucose absorption in the intestine and also improve cellular sensitivity to insulin, meaning that cells respond more efficiently to insulin signaling and take up glucose from the bloodstream more readily. Improved insulin sensitivity is clinically significant because one of the defining features of type 2 diabetes and prediabetes is insulin resistance, a state in which cells fail to respond normally to insulin despite adequate production of the hormone. Any dietary factor that supports insulin sensitivity, even modestly, contributes to more efficient blood sugar clearance following a meal. The timing aspect of the recommendation, consuming the fruit specifically at 3 in the afternoon, reflects several converging physiological considerations. The first is the natural afternoon glucose decline discussed earlier, which creates a window in which a slow-releasing carbohydrate source can provide steady glucose without triggering a sharp spike. The second is the circadian pattern of insulin secretion and insulin sensitivity. Research in chronobiology, the study of how biological processes follow time-based rhythms, has established that insulin sensitivity follows a circadian pattern, being highest in the morning and declining through the afternoon and into the evening. This means that the same food consumed at different times of day will produce different blood sugar responses, with carbohydrate-rich foods consumed later in the day tending to produce higher and more prolonged glucose elevations than the same foods consumed earlier. Consuming a moderate fiber-buffered carbohydrate source at 3 in the afternoon takes advantage of a point in the circadian cycle where insulin sensitivity is still reasonably maintained, while also providing glucose input before the sharper decline in sensitivity that characterizes the evening hours. The third timing-related consideration involves the gap between the afternoon snack and the evening meal. Consuming an apple at approximately 3 in the afternoon, if dinner is eaten at approximately 6 or 7 in the evening, creates a 3 to 4 hour buffer during which glucose from the apple is being slowly absorbed. Insulin is managing that absorption in a measured way, and appetite for the evening meal is arriving in a more moderate and regulated state. Research on meal timing and glucose control has found that blood sugar at the start of a meal, sometimes called pre-meal glucose, influences the magnitude of the postprandial glucose response to that meal. When pre-meal glucose is lower and more stable, the glucose response to the subsequent meal tends to be more controlled. Conversely, when pre-meal glucose is already elevated or unstable due to recent snacking on high glycemic foods, the post-dinner glucose curve is higher and more prolonged. The apple at 3 in this framework is not only managing afternoon glucose directly, but setting a more favorable glucose baseline for the evening meal. The claim of 8 hours of stable blood sugar, as it appears in popular health media, is a compressed representation of a more nuanced physiological reality. 8 hours would carry glucose stability from a 3 o'clock apple through an evening meal and into the overnight period. What research supports is a sequence of effects, rather than a single unbroken mechanism. The apple's fiber and polyphenols moderate the afternoon glucose response. The stable afternoon glucose baseline improves the pre-dinner metabolic state. A dinner consumed in that context, particularly if it is reasonably balanced in composition, produces a more moderate postprandial response. And overnight glucose regulation, which is managed by basal insulin secretion and glucagon-mediated liver glucose output, is more stable in individuals whose daytime glucose patterns have been well regulated than in those who have experienced significant glycemic variability. This is a cascade of connected effects, rather than a single 8-hour action of one food. But the cascade is real, and the component effects are individually supported by research. It is also important to consider the role of the gut microbiome in this picture. The fermentable fibers in apples, including pectin, serve as substrates for certain beneficial gut bacteria, particularly species within the genera Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus. When these bacteria ferment pectin, they produce short-chain fatty acids, including butyrate, propionate, and acetate. These compounds have several effects relevant to blood sugar regulation. Butyrate, produced primarily by certain Firmicutes species, supports the integrity of the gut lining and has been associated with improved insulin sensitivity. Propionate, produced in larger quantities from pectin fermentation, travels through the portal vein to the liver, where it influences hepatic glucose production, specifically by reducing the rate at which the liver generates new glucose through gluconeogenesis. The liver's overnight glucose output is a clinically significant factor in fasting blood sugar levels, and dietary strategies that modulate this output through the short-chain fatty acid pathway represent a biologically plausible mechanism by which fiber-rich foods consumed during the day can influence glucose regulation into the night. The research landscape on this topic also includes consideration of the specific variety of apple and whether the fruit is consumed with or without its skin. The skin of the apple contains the majority of quercetin and a substantial proportion of the fiber, including much of the insoluble fiber component that, while not forming the same gel as pectin, contributes to overall digestive transit and feeds different populations of gut bacteria. Studies that have compared peeled to unpeeled apple consumption in the context of glycemic response have generally found that consuming the whole apple with skin intact produces a more favorable blood sugar response than consuming only the flesh, which reinforces the importance of the whole food matrix rather than any single extracted compound. Among apple varieties, those with higher polyphenol content, which tend to be the more tart and pigmented varieties, such as Granny Smith, Fuji, and Braeburn, have been found in some studies to produce somewhat lower postprandial glucose responses than higher sugar varieties, though all whole apples remain substantially preferable to processed apple products. The endocrinological perspective on using whole fruit as a glycemic management tool sits within a broader framework of understanding how the timing, composition, and structure of food interact with hormonal regulation. Endocrinologists who focus on metabolic health and blood sugar management do not typically recommend eliminating fruit from the diets of patients with insulin resistance or early-stage type 2 diabetes. Instead, the emphasis is on choosing fruits with lower glycemic profiles, consuming them whole rather than juiced, pairing them with other macronutrients when possible, and timing their consumption to align with periods of higher insulin sensitivity and greater physiological need for glucose input. The 3 o'clock recommendation aligns with all of these principles simultaneously. It targets a period of natural glucose decline, capitalizes on still reasonable afternoon insulin sensitivity, provides a glucose source buffered by fiber and polyphenols, and positions the body favorably for the evening metabolic period. Individual variation is an important consideration in any discussion of dietary blood sugar management. Continuous glucose monitoring research, which allows individuals to measure their real-time blood sugar responses to specific foods, has revealed that glycemic responses to identical foods can vary substantially between individuals, even those of similar age and metabolic status. Factors including the composition of the gut microbiome, the individual's degree of insulin resistance, the baseline glucose level before the food is consumed, recent physical activity, sleep quality, and stress hormone levels all modulate how blood sugar responds to a given food at a given time. This does not invalidate the general principles described above. The buffering effects of pectin, the enzyme-inhibiting properties of quercetin, and the chronobiological context of afternoon carbohydrate metabolism are consistent biological phenomena. But it does mean that the specific magnitude of benefit will differ from person to person and cannot be guaranteed to produce identical outcomes across all individuals. The practical implications of this research extend to a broader understanding of snack selection and meal timing in the context of metabolic health. The principle that the 3 o'clock period is a meaningful window for targeted nutritional intervention is supported not only by glucose regulation research, but also by studies on appetite hormones. Ghrelin, the primary appetite-stimulating hormone, tends to rise in the mid-afternoon in many individuals, contributing to the experience of afternoon hunger. Consuming a satisfying food at this point, one that provides fiber, water, and a moderate amount of natural sugar, addresses the ghrelin-driven appetite signal while delivering the glucose in a form that does not trigger an exaggerated insulin response. Leptin, the hormone that signals satiety, is also influenced by the overall pattern of eating throughout the day, and maintaining more stable glucose and insulin patterns during the afternoon contributes to more coherent leptin signaling through the evening. From a public health standpoint, the accessibility and affordability of apples as an intervention tool is relevant. Whole apples are among the most widely available, widely consumed, and cost-effective whole foods in many parts of the world. They require no preparation, are easily portable, have a relatively long shelf life compared to most fresh produce, and are palatable to a broad range of individuals across age groups. For populations at elevated risk of type 2 diabetes, including older adults, individuals with family histories of metabolic disease, those with sedentary occupations, and communities with limited access to expensive health interventions, the incorporation of a daily whole apple as a targeted afternoon snack represents a low-barrier, evidence-informed strategy with no meaningful downside for most individuals. It is worth noting what the research does not claim, to maintain accuracy and avoid overstating the evidence. Eating an apple at 3 o'clock does not replace pharmaceutical management of diagnosed diabetes, does not eliminate the need for broader dietary changes in individuals with significant insulin resistance, and does not override the effects of a diet otherwise high in refined carbohydrates, ultra-processed foods, or excessive caloric intake. The apple is one component of a dietary and lifestyle context, not a standalone cure or a replacement for comprehensive metabolic management. Endocrinologists who reference fruit timing and selection as part of blood sugar management do so within the context of broader guidance that typically includes overall carbohydrate quality and quantity, physical activity, sleep regulation, stress management, and when necessary, medication. The fruit timing strategy is most effective when it reinforces and complements a broader pattern of metabolically supportive behavior. Looking forward, the growing field of chrononutrition, which studies how the timing of food intake interacts with circadian biology to influence metabolic outcomes, is likely to produce increasingly specific guidance about when different foods are best consumed for blood sugar management and overall metabolic health. Early research in this area has already established that carbohydrate tolerance follows a clear daily rhythm, and that the same meal consumed at different times of day produces meaningfully different hormonal and metabolic responses. As this research matures, and as continuous glucose monitoring becomes more widely available to non-diabetic individuals interested in metabolic optimization, the kind of time-specific dietary guidance represented by the 3 o'clock apple recommendation is likely to become more refined, more personalized, and more integrated into mainstream clinical practice. The science of blood sugar regulation is ultimately the science of how the body manages its energy supply moment to moment, and dietary choices are among the most consistent and modifiable factors that influence that management. Whole fruit, with its unique combination of naturally occurring sugars embedded within a matrix of fiber, water, and polyphenolic compounds, represents one of the most thoroughly studied dietary categories for supporting glucose stability without the glycemic disruption caused by refined sugars. The apple, consumed at a physiologically meaningful time of day, illustrates how the intersection of food composition, meal timing, gut physiology, circadian biology, and hormonal regulation can be leveraged through a simple, accessible, and well-supported dietary practice to support more stable blood sugar across the course of a day and into the overnight period.